My name is Tori and I am a doctor of physical therapy who specializes in pelvic dysfunction, which means I treat things that can go wrong around the pelvis, and this includes sexual dysfunction. If you haven't, be sure to check out the very first video in this series as it talks more about what's considered normal and abnormal surrounding female libido, and it outlines my intention behind creating this series, which is in short to walk you through how I would approach treating low libido as a patient who is also a pelvic health provider. Today's video is going to focus on how the female sex hormones affect libido and how to interpret the results of a hormone level test. That being said, in order to get the most out of today's video, it would be helpful to have some background knowledge on the female sex hormones and how they fluctuate and function in a female's body throughout her lifetime. If you feel like you need a review on those topics, check out the previous video in this series before watching this one. As always, you can check the description below for timestamps as well as links to any and all resources or studies mentioned today. And without further ado, let's begin by trying to answer the question, how do estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone affect female libido? There is virtually no controversy surrounding progesterone and how it influences female libido. The scientific community essentially agrees that it is a negative predictor of libido, which means it has a negative influence on sex drive, where high levels of progesterone are associated with low levels of libido. However, there is a lot of controversy surrounding estrogen and testosterone and how these hormones influence female libido. I've done a lot of research on this controversy, and I've come to the conclusion that estrogen is the primary hormone responsible for regulating and increasing female libido, and that testosterone has little influence on female libido. I will briefly discuss how I came to that conclusion in today's video. However, if you want to deep dive into the research with me and learn more about the controversy so that you can formulate your own opinion, check out this video to learn more. So for a long time, we thought that testosterone, not estrogen, was the primary hormone responsible for regulating and increasing female libido. However, as more and more evidence started to surface that it might be estrogen, not testosterone, we started to shift how we study the sex hormones and their influence on female sexual behavior. Recall that the female sex hormones are created and released by two pairs of endocrine glands: the adrenal glands, which live in our abdomens on top of our kidneys, and the ovaries, which are a part of the internal female reproductive system. While both of these glands contribute to the production of sex hormones, the scientific community agrees that it is the ovarian sex hormones, not the adrenal sex hormones, that primarily regulate female libido. The ovaries release their hormones in a pulsatile manner, which means they release different amounts of hormones at different times. They are responsible for most of the production of estrogen and at least 50% of the production of testosterone in female bodies. With this in mind, also recall that during a woman's menstrual cycle, the ovarian sex hormones rise and fall in a predictable pattern. Since the ovarian sex hormones primarily regulate female libido, and those hormones rise and fall in a predictable pattern during a woman's menstrual cycle, one way to try and figure out which ovarian hormone, estrogen or testosterone, is primarily responsible for regulating and increasing female libido would be to study the natural levels of the ovarian sex hormones and changes in libido during a woman's menstrual cycle. And that's exactly what doctors James Roney and Zachary Simmons decided to study in 2013. They followed 43 naturally cycling women. That means these these women weren't taking hormonal birth control or any other medication that might interfere with their hormone levels, and they took daily samples of their ovarian sex hormones over the period of 1 to 2 menstrual cycles. Meanwhile, these women were completing a daily questionnaire that measured their libido and other forms of sexual behavior. As I mentioned earlier, there's virtually no controversy surrounding progesterone and how it influences female libido. The scientific community agrees that it is a negative predictor of female libido, where high levels of progesterone are associated with low levels of sex drive. And that's exactly what Roney and Simmons found in their study. However, they also found that estrogen was a positive predictor of female libido, meaning that high levels of estrogen were associated with high levels of sex drive and low levels of estrogen were associated with low levels of sex drive. They also found that natural testosterone levels never reliably predicted libido or any other form of sexual behavior at any point during the study. This study's findings, compiled with the other research that I've done, have informed my opinion that estrogen, not testosterone, is the primary hormone responsible for regulating and increasing female libido. So, to recap, in my opinion, the research suggests that progesterone is a negative predictor of female libido, where high levels of progesterone are associated with low levels of sex drive, that estrogen is a positive predictor of female libido, where high levels of estrogen are associated with high levels of sex drive, and low levels of estrogen are associated with low levels of sex drive, and finally, that natural levels of testosterone do not reliably predict female libido. Given what the research suggests, if it were me and I were trying to figure out whether or not my hormone levels were contributing to a decrease in my sex drive, I would focus first on my estrogen levels, then my progesterone levels, and finally, my testosterone levels. With that in mind, let's shift our focus to how to interpret the results of a hormone level test. Before we get into specifics, there are some general things about hormone testing that you should know. There are 3 kinds of hormone tests: blood tests, saliva tests, and urine tests. Blood tests and saliva tests are more commonly used in the clinic, where urine tests are more commonly used in research. The way that blood tests and saliva tests measure hormone levels is different, and I think it's important that you understand that difference. Recall that hormones travel in our bodies via our bloodstream. There is a protein found in our blood that binds to the sex hormones, but it does so reversibly, which means a bound hormone can also be unbound. However, when a hormone is bound to this protein, it is considered biologically inactive, which means it does not have an effect on the person's body when it is bound. That means there are different ways to measure hormone levels. You can measure the total amount of the hormone, bound and unbound, or you can measure the amount of bioavailable free hormone, which is the amount of unbound hormone. While blood tests do tend to measure the amount of free testosterone and the amount of total testosterone, they tend to only measure the total amount of estrogen and progesterone, which means their results can be misleading. For example, your total estrogen levels might appear normal because you have a lot of bound estrogen in your blood. However, if you have a low amount of unbound, free, bioavailable estrogen in your blood, you might still be functionally deficient even though the total amount of estrogen is within normal limits. Saliva tests, on the other hand, tend to measure the amount of free levels of all of the hormones instead of their total levels. So if it were me, I would want both a blood test and a saliva test because I would want to know both the total levels and the free levels of all of my sex hormones so that I could paint a more comprehensive functional picture of my body. Of course, multiple testing methods like what I'm proposing might not be practical because of financial or insurance-based barriers, but in an ideal world, I would push for both tests. Now that we've reviewed some general information about hormone tests, let's talk about specific hormone levels. We'll begin with estrogen, then we'll talk about progesterone, and we'll end by discussing testosterone. Before we talk numbers, it's important to know that your body produces different kinds of estrogen. The three main estrogens produced by the body are estrone, known as E1, estradiol, known as E2, and estriol, known as E3. Both estrone and estriol are considered weak estrogens, while estradiol is considered a strong estrogen. Estradiol is pretty much universally viewed as the major estrogen produced by female bodies. For this reason, when interpreting the results of a hormone level test, healthcare providers will usually focus on the levels of estradiol, not estrone or estriol. In fact, some hormone level tests will only include estradiol results for this same reason. With that being said, now let's talk numbers. What are normal levels of estradiol? It's very important that you know that the numbers that I'm going to present to you are values that I've collected from a variety of sources. That's because the normal estradiol levels and the normal levels of any of the hormones can vary depending on the lab that performs the test and the kind of test being performed. In fact, different labs tend to have different normal value ranges or normal value references. So if it were me, I would ask the lab that was in charge of my testing for a copy of their references so that I could compare those references, those numbers, with my results. With that being said, know that estradiol levels are typically measured in one of two units: picogram per milliliter or picomole per liter. In a premenopausal, naturally cycling adult female, meaning a female of reproductive age who is not taking hormonal birth control or other medication that might affect her hormones, we'd expect to see total estradiol levels that range from 15 to 350 picograms per milliliter or 55 to 1,285 picomoles per liter. There is a wide range here because recall that during a woman's menstrual cycle, estrogen levels vary greatly, with a mid-cycle peak leading up to and during ovulation, and a second peak during the luteal phase. So, more specifically, we'd expect lower numbers in the beginning of the follicular phase, higher numbers leading up to and during the ovulatory phase, and middle numbers during the luteal phase. In a postmenopausal adult female, we'd expect to see total estradiol levels that range from 0 to 10 picograms per milliliter or 0 to 37 picomoles per liter. As far as free estradiol levels go, I couldn't find a resource that differentiated pre versus postmenopausal levels. However, I did learn that in adult females, we'd expect free estradiol levels to range from 0.6 to 7.1 picograms per milliliter. Now let's shift to progesterone. Progesterone levels are typically measured in one of two units: nanogram per milliliter or nanomole per liter. In a premenopausal, naturally cycling adult female, we'd expect to see total progesterone levels that range from 1 to 20 nanograms per milliliter or 3.2 to 63.6 nanomoles per liter. Again, recall that during a woman's menstrual cycle, progesterone levels also vary, which is why we see a wide range in normal progesterone levels in premenopausal women. More specifically, we'd expect to see lower numbers during the follicular phase, medium numbers during the ovulatory phase, and higher numbers during the luteal phase. In a postmenopausal adult female, we'd expect to see total progesterone levels that range from 0 to 1.1 nanograms per milliliter or 0 to 3.5 nanomoles per liter. Finally, finding normal free progesterone levels was also tricky. I again couldn't find a resource that differentiated pre versus postmenopausal levels. However, I did find this 2012 study that investigated free salivary levels of progesterone in adult naturally cycling premenopausal women. This study reported ranges from 0.06 to 0.12 nanograms per milliliter of free progesterone. Again, if it were me, I would ask the lab in charge of my testing for a copy of their reference numbers so that I could compare those values with the results of my test. Lastly, let's discuss testosterone. Again, total testosterone levels and free testosterone levels are usually available with just a blood test. However, you might see 3 different results: bioavailable, free, and total testosterone. Don't worry too much about the difference between bioavailable and free testosterone. For simplicity's sake, regard bioavailable and free testosterone as unbound testosterone and total testosterone as unbound and bound testosterone together. Testosterone is typically measured in the units nanogram per deciliter. Also, recall that testosterone levels in women are much more affected by that woman's age than they are by her menstrual cycle. A woman's testosterone levels naturally peak in her 20s and slowly decline as she ages, regardless of whether or not she's gone through menopause. With that in mind, we'd expect total levels of testosterone in women to range from 8 to 60 nanograms per deciliter, and the free levels of testosterone to range from 0.06 to 1.08 nanograms per deciliter, depending on the age of the woman. To recap everything that we've talked about so far, there are different kinds of hormone level tests that measure different levels of hormones. Blood tests tend to measure both total and free levels of testosterone, but only total levels of estrogen and progesterone. Saliva tests tend to measure free levels of all of the sex hormones, and urine tests aren't really used very often in the clinic. We see those used a lot more in research. In my opinion, it would be the most helpful to have both a blood test and a saliva test, because knowing both the total and free levels of all 3 sex hormones would paint a more comprehensive functional picture of the body. Normal values of the free and total levels of the sex hormones vary depending on the lab performing the test and the type of test being performed. In my opinion, it would be the most helpful to ask the lab in charge of testing for a copy of their normal value ranges so that those references can be compared to the results of that test. Now that you have a better idea of the different kinds of hormone tests that exist, how they measure hormone levels, and some examples of what normal ranges are, I do want to remind you of the variables that you should consider when interpreting the results of your test. Generally speaking, it is important to remember that the ovaries release sex hormones in a pulsatile manner, which means they release different amounts of hormones at different times. That means we'd expect to see different levels of the sex hormones at different times throughout the day, which means the time of day you take your test will affect your results. This isn't always a big deal, but it does mean that either test, a blood test or a saliva test, will only ever capture a single point in time, a snapshot of your hormone levels. Because the ovarian sex hormones are released in pulses, it's hard to know whether that snapshot is a picture of a peak, a picture of a valley, or a picture of some point in between. More specifically, it's incredibly important to think about your unique body and what's happened to you that might influence your hormone levels. For example, how old are you? Are you taking hormonal birth control or a different medication that might affect your hormone production? Do you have a medical condition that you know affects your hormone production? If you're a naturally cycling female, then where are you in your menstrual cycle? Or have you ever had your ovaries surgically removed? Try to be as thoughtful and thorough as you possibly can, and don't hesitate to ask your provider follow-up questions once you've had a chance to investigate and really digest the results of your hormone test. I want to end by sharing a relevant story about a dear friend of mine. He is my age, he's in his late 20s, early 30s, and he's struggled with his energy levels, feeling a lot of fatigue, his ability to build muscle, and not his sex drive, but his interest in sex. He's always felt like he should be more excited about sex. He struggled with these things for a long time, and he got his hormone levels tested years ago, and his results came back as normal. However, during the pandemic, his primary care physician, his primary doctor, ended up retiring, and he got a new one. This new doctor wanted to test his hormone levels again, and again his results came back as normal. However, his testosterone levels were on the very low end of normal. And again, he's my age. He's in his late 20s, his early 30s, so it's bizarre that his testosterone levels, while normal, would be in that low normal range. So his new doctor suggested that he start taking testosterone, that they start him on testosterone therapy. And lo and behold, his energy levels have significantly improved, his ability to build muscle has significantly improved, and his sex drive, his interest in sex, all of that has significantly improved. He is doing so much better. And while his testosterone levels are higher than they were before, they're still within normal limits. It's this attention to detail that unfortunately often gets lost in healthcare, and sometimes that is due to providers not caring as much as they maybe should, but other times it's because the providers are human and they make a mistake, or other times it's because they want to care. They very much want to give each patient that kind of time and that kind of attention, but they can't because they're expected to see so many patients within a day. Whatever the reason, this is why I will always encourage you to rely radically on yourself when it comes to your health. Female sex drive is not solely created by the sex hormones, but it is influenced by them. So read your own results, ask your provider questions, do your research, embrace trial and error, and trust your intuition. On that note, thank you so much for watching. I am approaching this series differently than any other content that I've created in the past, so let me know what you think of this style. I'm very open to your criticisms and your feedback, so if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't like the video, please give it a thumbs down. Feel free to comment absolutely anything down below. Your feedback, your questions, your content suggestions, you name it. I do try very hard to read and respond to all of my comments. Don't forget to check me out on Instagram, and finally, if you want to, please subscribe to the channel for more content, not only about pelvic things like today's video, but also about life things. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.